And good day, and we're live. Good day at this new virtual domain-driven design meetup. Joining me today is Mathias, and we're going to talk about the strategic patterns in the DDD book. Welcome, Mathias.
Thank you.
So can you please explain for the people who don't know you, can you explain something about yourself?
I'm a consultant. I have a small consultancy company. We help organizations do software design and architecture and modeling and DDD, that sort of thing. And I also organize Domain-Driven Design Europe, the conference in Amsterdam next February.
Nice. So the big thing about the book, the blue book, which we're going to talk about, is part 4. And I think every time I give a workshop or a talk and you ask to people who read the book, then maybe half put up their hand, and then you talk, okay, who read part 4? And then most hands goes down, and that's the part that we're going to talk about. So can you explain a bit what are the strategic patterns in part 4, and can you give a basic understanding of people who haven't read that part?
Yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting that that a lot of people haven't really read this book or haven't finished it. It's a classic, which is the definition I once read of a classic is that everybody has it on their shelf, but nobody has read it. So it's interesting that this book seems to be growing in importance and influence, and still people don't read it. Maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about why that is, or maybe people have some ideas of why they haven't read it. But I think it's normal that that it's not an easy read, because it is a book about complexity. And the fourth part is talking about dealing with complexity in larger scale, at the level of thinking about the domains you're dealing with, and thinking about context, and thinking about even larger scale structures than that. Whereas the beginning of the book is about design patterns and ubiquitous language and things that are maybe a little bit closer to what programmers are used to talking about and thinking about. So all of that sort of makes it very, very hard to sort of get a grasp of the whole book, I think, because it's one of the few books, I think, in software that tries to, or attempts to, talk about software design from the very small, the smallest thing you can do, a value object, to very large structures. It's usually one slice of that pie. So I think that sort of puts people off. The language isn't necessarily very easy. He introduces a lot of terms, like cohesive mechanisms is one of those terms that when you hear it, it probably doesn't make sense at all. At least value object, that that's something you can understand or have some intuitive understanding of it. So that doesn't really make it easy. It's easier if you think about it as a patterns book, and a typical patterns book describes things that people are actually doing, things that have been observed in the wild, things that maybe people listening here are already doing, but never thought of it as a pattern or a thing or a concept that could be reusable, or that even could have a name. So if you look at it that way and you try to see, is this stuff that we're already doing, that I've already seen, or that I've thought about maybe and I haven't really tried because I didn't know it could be done or was a thing, or that people even thought about this stuff. So if you look for that and then see, okay, and then this is sort of the way he explains it, and this is the pattern name he has for it. I think that makes it a bit easier. And so what I want to try now is sort of guide people through the fourth chapter, well, not chapter, but the fourth part, which is about the last 180 pages of the book. I don't know if you can see this, but I sort of describe the structure of that part, so that hopefully it's less scary for people to read it.
Yes.
I think.
So
sorry.
I have that question. Like, I think there's many ways, and we can discuss it later, why people don't read part 4. But when you start at part 4, is that the correct beginning? Does it build up correctly from part 4?
Well, the book builds up in the sense that it starts from very small things to and basic
Mhm.
concepts to very large structures. But I think part four could be read mostly independently. I've been now sort of rereading it to do this session. I tried to read it differently, just sort of trying to understand the structure and the which is a different way than I would normally read it. And I think it's readable on its own, except that sometimes it references other concepts like ubiquitous language, etc. So you might not understand every bit of it if you
Yeah.
read it standalone, but I think it's possible. And maybe that's one of the things that puts people off, that if you read something and you don't understand all of it, um, I think people maybe stop or get discouraged. Um, the better approach, I think, is try to read all of it, even if you don't understand everything, and then go back and try again, or go back and look at what sort of concepts am I missing to properly understand this.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe another reason, now that I think of it, is that people are trying to read this book because it's an important one, and it's being mentioned a lot. So they're trying to read this book. But if you have never read any other books about software design, maybe if you're a beginning programmer, then I don't think this is a very good beginner's book in that sense. If you haven't read, I don't know, Martin Fowler and Rebecca Ross-Brock, or maybe older things like Object Thinking by David West, or trying to
Yeah.
think of the title, Jill Nicola, object something something object. I mean,
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say is there's a whole body of software design literature out there, and if you have read none of it and you start with a book like that, you're going to have maybe a bit of a hard time. Um, One approach that might work, a friend of mine was a musician, and he wanted to get into acoustics, but he had never had much mathematics or physics or anything, but he was interested in building recording studios and things like that. And he started by trying to read a book on acoustics. And as soon as he couldn't understand it anymore, he tried to find the book that he should have read first. So he read maybe like 3 pages, and then had to go back to basic physics, and even further back to basic mathematics, and then build up again the whole way. And by the time he got back to acoustics, he really understood it. That was like 2 years later, maybe, but he had
Yeah.
built up sort of all the basic knowledge to get there. And I think people maybe want sort of I'm a Twitter user. I like reading short, quick insights in 280 characters, but sometimes you have to go for the long term and try, building up your knowledge, thinking about not how is this going to help me next week, but how is this going to help me in 2 or 5 or 10 years. So
Yeah.
that might be. I feel that now, 10 years after I first read the book, I'm still getting new value from it, things that I'm now really starting to grasp and understand.
Yeah. So going back to that 280 characters Twitter, what it's not possible, but what is the essence of the part four? But maybe the first part of part four, contextual contact mapping. So shall we start at?
Well,
I,
it doesn't start with context mapping.
I thought,
It starts with bounded context, but
yeah,
I think I had basically the first 2 pages of part four explain sort of the whole chapter. So I have basically it touches on all the topics here, and I think maybe this quote here would be the most relevant there. It says, this part of the book presents principles that enable the modeling process to scale up to very complicated domains. Most such decisions must be made at team level or even negotiated between teams. And these are the decisions where design and politics often intersect. Um, and then it says, let me see, the goal of the most ambitious enterprise system is a tightly integrated system spanning the entire business. Yet the entire business model for almost any such organization is too large and complex to manage or even understand as a single unit. So this is, to me, this sort of explains the whole point of strategic design. We very large systems. I'm talking multiple millions of lines of code with multiple teams, and and long living systems that exist for 10 or 20 or longer years, you cannot really understand it. You cannot keep them in your head at any point in time. Nobody knows everything about it. It would be even impossible just to read all the lines of code, let alone understand all of it. So how do you manage something like that? And of course, that's sort of typically the problem space of architects. But I feel that domain-driven design or the strategic design part offers some sort of alternative approaches and mindsets that are not often, I think, discussed by sort of traditional architects, architecture ideas.
Yeah, because it sounds like part four goes more into architecture, software architects. So you would traditionally, is it something developers don't read, and what I hear you say now, classic architects don't read? How is how is it that classic architects may not read it, and what is the value for them to read this?
I don't know. Well, some read it, and um, I've worked with people who are architects at these kinds of very large systems, SAP, that sort of scale, and they do read. I mean, some people read the stuff, not everybody, I guess. Um, but again, it's not. Well, this is something that people are starting to get aware of. That DDD is not really a technical thing. It's about modeling. It's about understanding a domain. It's about reasoning about the relationships between models and language and that sort of thing, and applying that to system design at any scale. So it's hard enough, just learning technologies and learning. It moves so fast. When I started in this business, the things that were hot then are now completely outdated. We didn't have words like microservice and whatever. Just keeping up with that, and then keeping up with the technologies that enable that sort of technical infrastructure is hard enough as it is. So it's understandable that um, people are not necessarily going to look into something like DDD as well. But the thing about, and I like this quote by Ruth Malan. She's an architect from the US, and I think it's her quote that sure, we have programmers and people mining the system, but somebody needs to mine the system of systems. Somebody needs to think about the bigger picture and the whole and the connections between all of it, and how to strategy, how to make the system work in 2 years and 5 years and 10 years. Where are we going with that? So all
Yeah,
of that is sort of the topic of strategic design.
yeah. So that would classically be an IT architect, right?
Sure,
Do
but yeah, but these terms, the problem with roles, of course, is if you define it too strictly, then it becomes siloed, and you get, well, it's a
yeah.
cliche, but the ivory tower architect, etc. This is something that I think more to the end of the part that Eric describes. I'm not sure if I can find it that fast, but he's sort of giving general advice. The very last chapter, and he says that
Chapter called?
I'm
The
sorry.
which chapter is that?
The very last one, 17. So he says here, he has 6 essentials for strategic design decision making, and the first one is decisions must reach the entire team. So um, if you stop at the architect and only the architect understands large scale structure and bounded context and domain distillation, you're not going to get the benefits of this. And the feeling I had this afternoon, rereading or skimming through some of the parts, is that a lot of these problems with very large systems is you can solve them if you communicate better and more to everybody involved in doing it. But the problem with communicating more is that, what's the line? You can solve all problems with better communication, except the problem of too much communication, something like that. So if you want to start thinking about the entire system and the strategy for the system of systems and all of that, and communicating that to everybody down to the last junior developer, then everybody's going to be in meetings the whole day, every day, and no system will be built. So it's always going to be this kind of trade-offs. So is it the job of an architect, or is it everybody's job? Somewhere in the middle of that is
Yeah.
probably the right answer.
So I got a question here from someone, and
Okay.
it says, so I also started as a developer. So tell me, how can I start applying this tomorrow? So what do you actually need? What is your tips? Is it reading some parts of the strategic book first and then doing it, or?
Yeah, well, that's the problem with strategy, of course. That strategy is not the thing you start doing tomorrow. It's a thing that you start, that's a process. You can The thing you can start doing tomorrow is tactics, right?
Mhm.
It's do some event storming tomorrow, or learn how to do it tomorrow, and then do it the day after tomorrow. Start with a small group of people in your lunch break. Do some modeling. Go to a whiteboard. Those are tactics. Um, have a discussion about the language of something, refactor something, think about, and then it gets more into these, the maybe more advanced ideas in domain-driven design. Start thinking about, I have this one model here, this one context. Um, are there maybe different responsibilities in there? Can we start thinking about separating, here is the assets, and here are the rules about operating on the assets, right? That might be a way to separate a model. That's things that maybe you can start doing in the very short term. um, but strategic design in DDD is more about, where should we focus our efforts. um, how should we, so that's domain distillation. That's one of the three chapters in the strategic design part. That's something that you can start having a discussion about that with other people, but it's going to take some time to sort of evolve these ideas and get more insights. And you can't really decide on the perfect bounded context if you haven't modeled them, if you haven't tried to separate them, and then realize that, wait a minute, we thought these could be two separate things, but they're more tightly coupled than we thought. So all of that takes time.
Yeah. So you're talking about distilling, right? About
Yes.
distilling the core, which is a huge chapter in the book.
Yeah. So
May
maybe
I
we should talk
elaborate on
about.
that? Because here
Oh,
it
sorry.
sometimes gets a bit fussy for people.
Yeah.
So can you maybe elaborate on that part? Because does it sit in the problem space? Is it part of the solution space? How do they match? How do they align? These are a lot of questions I hear.
Yeah, I think it might be, from the three parts of the strategic design chapter in the book, or well, part chapter. But so domain distillation is probably the easiest to sort of grasp if you're beginning with DDD, because the idea of, what is your core domain, that's something that people, I think, naturally grasp. Your core domain is the stuff that gives you your competitive advantage as a business, right? It's a discussion you need to have with the business. What are we doing? Why does this business exist? How do we make money, or whatever the value is that you want to get? What makes us different? What is the thing that we do that nobody else can do? That's probably your core domain. And then a lot of the stuff in this chapter is about, some of it is about identifying that, and that's a strategic design thing, right? If you know, what is my core domain, what are generic subdomains, etc., then you can start focusing more on that core. Put your energy there. Eric writes in the book, put your top talent there, right? That's so. And then a bunch of the things in the book are tactics for dealing, for distilling your domain. If we look at, it's chapter 15, it's called distillation, and then it explains what is a core domain and what are generic subdomains. And then it's basically a bunch of tactics for working with that, and getting that ID, across to the rest of the organization, of where to focus and where to put effort, and how to highlight, the pattern is called highlighted core. How do we get that essential bit, that essence of what our core domain is, can we make that sort of, can we lift that up? Can we make that standalone? Can we
Yeah.
protect that? Can we extract everything in there that is still just sort of, so maybe it's not even a generic subdomain, but there could be stuff in the core domain that isn't really that unique or special, but that you need to make it work. And the example that Eric gives in the book, let me see, I think that's over here somewhere. Here. So one of the patterns is what he calls cohesive mechanisms. And the example he gives is, well, let's say you have some core domain, and there's rules in there, all kinds of business rules, and you need to do complex things with combining these rules, etc. And earlier in the book, he talks about the specification pattern as one example of doing that. But in the specification pattern, you can do things like combine them using and or and not, etc., and sort of make compositions of business rules. That's what I would call them. So if you have some code that manages this work of composing business rules, he says extract that as well. That's a cohesive mechanism. That's not a subdomain. That's not a bounded context. That's almost like maybe a library, a small library for composing business rules or specifications. But it's not even a library in the sense that maybe you don't even want to reuse this or anything, because it's really supporting the core domain, but it's not a supporting subdomain. Right. I don't know if this makes sense as an
So
explanation, but
if I elaborate, it's part of your core domain, and you only need it once, only for the core domain, but not for
yeah,
other domains. So you
yeah,
can really bound it inside our core domain.
yeah. But the result of doing that, it's a refactoring, right? It's basically a refactoring pattern. It's tactics for getting better strategy, right?
Yeah.
So the refactoring pattern cohesive mechanism, if we call it that, is find some utility code in your core domain and work hard on extracting that as well to some degree, so that your core domain becomes even more highlighted and visible, right? And this is what he calls highlighted core. And then if you combine that with something that he calls, now I lost the term, not revealing interfaces, but conceptual contours, right? Which is another, it's elsewhere in the book, right? So that's one of these things that if you have read the whole book and you understand that part, then understanding this example of cohesive mechanisms in the domain distillation part becomes easier. So conceptual contours is basically the idea that your code, your model should look like your domain. It should have the shape of your domain. Which sounds vague if I say
Yeah.
it like that, but
That's
he has examples in the book, right?
yeah.
So what I would do then is, try to understand this chapter on domain installation, and maybe write down stuff that isn't very clear. Go back, think about the guy with the acoustic stuff. Go back and research that bit. He says use conceptual contours. What is that? What does that look like? Read the examples. Try to really work through the examples. See how he evolves code to explain it, and then go back and read this and say, oh yes, so now my core domain model, the model for my core domain looks like the kind of concepts that exist in my domain with the people working in my domain. That's how they would think about this structure is similar.
So one ambiguity I hear a lot zooming through the community and outside is the word domain. How does a domain also relate to bounded context?
Yeah,
So you were talking more about it's inside your core domain, but is it inside a bounded context and these cohesive mechanisms, and do you create a own bounded context? Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because I
yeah,
hear a lot of what is a domain, what's a domain model, what's a domain language, these concepts.
yeah. Well, yeah, domain is as you suggested, that's the problem space, right? That's the world of the customer or the business that we need to solve for. And that usually we don't have that much control over. We cannot really change how the business works or how banking works or how regulations for banking work. But we can build software for it to help solve the problems that they have, and hopefully even build software that enables new and more complex behaviors in those domains. So that's a domain. That's really the world of the business. high level, if you are in banking, then your domain is banking or finance, right? But of course, that's not really, domain distillation is typically looking for a bit more precise. We I don't know, we forecast cash flows or something. That might be your core domain. You have a whole bunch of stuff around that is not your core domain, because you need to have, well, technical stuff. You need to have user interface, you need to have database, but you need to have maybe a project management app that people use to actually interact with those forecasts, and I don't know, share forecasts, and have permissions on who can see them, and all of that stuff, right? So domain distillation is really about that. What is this? What are these domains, and what are all these other things? Um, and I think it's valuable, even without doing anything else from DDD, but it's valuable to really understand um, what are these domains, and which ones do we care about, and where should we focus the most of our attention and effort. So that's what domains are. Bounded contexts are something entirely different, but very often, and I think maybe it would have been better if the domain distillation part was first, and then the bounded context part was separate. Bounded contexts are, in a sense, maybe the most important or unique innovation of DDD. And of course, it's one of those things that other people have done it. But I read Data and Reality recently by William Kent, which predates DDD by, I don't know, 25 or 30 years. And he gets very close to bounded context without ever sort of grasping the idea in that sense. So what is bounded context? It's the idea that if we start thinking about language, what is that ubiquitous language, and making this language very concrete, we start thinking about models, and we start thinking about the idea that we cannot have a single model for an entire system. For a huge organization, we cannot unify that model. We cannot attempt to, well, we can attempt it, of course. That's what people do, right? They say, well, this
Data
whole
model, right?
system is, I'm sorry?
The canonical data model tries to
Yes. Oh, this
one
whole
angle.
system is a mess. We
Yeah,
have so many stuff here. Let's make the canonical model. Let's try to agree on this one big model, and we'll have 200 pages of diagrams and terminology and definitions, and then enforce this on everybody, and all our problems will be solved because we will all understand each other. It would be nice if that would work, but it doesn't, because language is very messy, right? People.
yeah.
This is why I usually make a distinction between domain language and ubiquitous language. Domain language is the messy, ambiguous, organic
Fluid
language that
one.
people use.
Yeah.
And people continuously adapt language, and they adopt words from different things. And, oh, we use this word because, well, everybody calls it that. Or, yeah, that's sort of the same word, but we use it here somewhat differently. Or, oh, yeah, those two different words mean the same thing, but really they don't. There's some slight nuance, and that evolves, and people change that. And
Vladik posted a nice tweet this week about the word quite, that in
right, yeah, I
English
saw that.
means something totally different than, not totally, but different than in America. So,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah,
also,
and anything, even just an example I often use is product in an e-commerce
yeah,
environment. A product is something you can sell with pictures and customer reviews and a price. If you're in sales, if you're in shipping, it's something in a box that you have to move back and forth.
yeah,
Um, so what is our core domain? Well, our core domain is e-commerce, or maybe something more specific. Maybe our core domain is that we have very smart suggestions that make people want to buy, or we have a one-click thing, or we have something that makes people want to come back. But our bounded contexts, they're about language. They're about to solve this problem. We have different people. It's social, right? The domain languages are social. If you work with the same group of people doing sales, your language is going to evolve and to fit your needs. And the people in shipping, their language is going to evolve to ship your needs. So, and this is exactly what context is, of course.
yeah.
The
Yeah,
meaning of the
I
word.
talked with my wife, who's an anthropologist, and I said, well, we try to make small, consistent language. And then he's like, well, that's hard because language is always fluid, but
Yeah.
doesn't mean you need to
Yes.
try it, of course.
But that's the point of ubiquitous language. It's
Yeah.
you look at those domain languages and you say, well, of course, in programming we cannot have ambiguity,
No.
and it makes communication harder, etc.
Well,
So a
we can have
ubiquitous,
it, but
yeah,
give
well,
it.
computers might disagree,
Yeah.
but so the idea is that this domain language, we need to somehow capture that, we need to somehow formalize that, and that depends on your needs, right? If you are in a highly constrained, or in a domain where, let's say you're NASA, or you make dosage calculations for chemotherapy, you want a very formalized language, you want to be very strict, you want to have very clear, unambiguous definitions. And maybe if you're, I don't know, some smaller, less life critical business, maybe it's not that important to be super formal. But there's going to be some difference between that domain language and the language that you as a software designer need to sort of grasp and give a shape and formalize, right? That's a ubiquitous language. That's a language where you have agreed on terms, as opposed to just by convention or by usage. You write them down, so to speak, and say, well, from now on here, we're going to stick to this definition. And then, of course, if the domain language evolves, you're going to evolve your ubiquitous language. But the problem
You
is,
can decide that, of course.
yes, that's a design decision. And
Yeah.
ideally, in domain-driven design, of course, when the domain language changes, your ubiquitous language
Yeah.
should probably change along. It might even be the other direction, that you influence the domain language
Yeah.
by formalizing a ubiquitous language. But
I think that's a point people also forget sometimes, that uh, ubiquitous language can influence or needs, actually, in my opinion, influence the domain language.
yeah, but you cannot force it. That's the hard thing.
No, you
It
cannot.
needs to be by agreement. And even if people
Yeah.
agree with it, they might not actually do it. And you might be the annoying person in the
Yeah.
meeting saying,
The
no,
police.
that's not product. We agreed to call this, whatever this thing. The
But
language police.
that's I think that's a tip I always give. If you see this happening, always ask why, and why are they still using another language? Is it really
Yeah.
something else?
Yeah, you might have missed something. There
Yeah.
might be another concept hiding, or maybe your language that you agreed upon wasn't very good to begin with. So it's going to be
Yeah.
continuous process,
That's
and
fine.
yeah,
It doesn't.
some concepts are going to stabilize over time. Something that Eric mentioned in the talk somewhere is, use, if the concept isn't very clear, use an awkward term for it
Yeah.
at first, and then later, an awkward term invites you to discuss it again later, and maybe you understand the concept better and you find a term for it.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an evolution, right? It's most definitely, domain-driven design is not a design upfront
No.
approach. It's very much, all of the book is about evolving it and refactoring, and finding deeper insights, changing the languages, changing the model. But
That
so
part is not in the book, right? The modeling whirlpool thing. It's
yeah, that's sort of a model for
later
explaining
book.
the process of doing
Yeah.
DDD, in a sense. But DDD is not even a methodology.
No.
It's um, I call it a discipline, because it's a bunch of mindsets that, if you apply those, you gradually get more benefits from them. That's, to me, sort of the closest. It's not a value system like XP. XP is extreme programming is a value system first, then principles, and then methods or practices. DDD is not really a value system in that sense. It's not really principles. There's principles in there, but it's the way the book is written. In any case, is not really, here are some principles or rules or whatever. So it's more of a mindset. Eric called it an applied philosophy, I think, at the last DDD Europe. I like to call it a discipline. It's not a methodology. It's not, here are the 5 steps to perfect software design that will solve all your complex needs, right?
I think
But
that relates to a question I think Daniel has, because, and this is also the struggle usually people give. So just give me some structure or steps that
yeah,
we're going to do. And the question Daniel has is, could you briefly explain what modeling paradigms approaches have you used? Which of them are also described in the Blue Book, and what might they be a good fit in addressing a domain problem?
yeah.
So
So because DDD is not a methodology, it doesn't prescribe one method of doing anything, of doing modeling, or it has some underlying concepts and principles, I guess. Even though it's not not a pure set of principles. It's even Eric doesn't define DDD, but there are a lot of methods derived from DDD that apply this stuff. Event storming is one of those that was invented 10 years after the book was written. Is that a modeling paradigm? I don't know. It's a method, right? It's start like this, right? The steps for starting with event storming are very simple. You know, get some post-its and you know, write down domain events and put them on the timeline and etc. So that's a modeling methodology. People have proposed others. There's you know, CRC cards, these kinds of things. UML is not really a methodology, but you can sort of use it as such. Model storming is sort of where you come up with the notations and the visualizations as you go along, right? Where you're sort of, especially in sort of very unknown domains, you're not sure yet how to express this model. You don't have the model yet. You don't even have the ways to express the model yet. So you're sort of inventing that at the same time. These are all ways, you know, the principle is probably, if we want to formulate a principle, it's do modeling, right? And use approaches to find different models, and use approaches that give you new insights into possible models, and then trade off those models and evolve them and compare them, etc. I think maybe
that's something people usually don't do, right? I always say the power of three. So in this way, just try to find another model.
Yeah.
That's actually in the technical part of the book where Eric, I think, goes into, and I don't want to go into deep, but about this electrical PCB design. And then he says, well, we tried this, let's see it from another view. I think
Yeah.
that's really
I
strong.
think the chief heuristic of modeling in DDD is there's always another model.
Yeah.
Right? It might be better, it might be worse, it might have some benefits and downsides, right? And then you make the trade-off. So the method could be, you know, use 3 different modeling styles. So hopefully you find 3 different models, and then compare them or decide which to use for now, and keep the other ones in the back of your head. Or even keep a bunch of models at the same time and say, well, let's keep evolving all 3 of them instead of picking just one and being stuck with it forever. That's my chief heuristic, really. I look at a customer, a client once asked me, how do you come up with different models? I couldn't answer it back then. That was in 2013. I remember the day. But I started thinking about my heuristics for finding new models. And later on, I realized that that was a cheap one, that I assume that there are different possible models. The hard thing is when you see one model, it's hard to see other models. Yeah. So you have to sort of force your brain into seeing other things. And then some of the things in the book are really good advice on how to do that, or examples, really.
Yeah. So are there any modeling paradigms approaches in the Blue Book itself? So we talk
Yeah,
about.
so I don't know what a paradigm is, but I can give some examples from the book. So even in the strategic design pattern, some of the examples are really tactics, right? So it's saying we didn't really finish this defining bounded context, but there's some examples in here that help you think about these bounded contexts. There's examples in here that help you model a core domain and highlight that core. And I think one of them, I had a post-it here. You know, I think actually this one is in the large scale structure chapter, responsibility layers, where Eric starts talking about, well, you might have a model, or even a bunch of models, a set of bounded contexts that together solve a complex domain. He says, well, even then, even if you have modules, or even if you have bounded contexts, it might be a mess. It might be hard to understand all of it. You know, modules help understand. That's the point of modules, of course, to help understand, and the point of bound context, to help something make something understandable in isolation. But if you have a lot of them, it's still hard to see the bigger picture. And then he starts sort of going through examples and explaining how he separates layers of bounded context. And they're not technical layers the way that typically we think about architecture. They're really in the domain, and they're really about things like, you know, what are our resources? What are the regulations on those resources? What kind of operations can we do? What kind of decisions are being made? with those regulations and etc. And let's look for layers there. And well, I think it's the cargo example again here. So here he talks about, here one example has a capability layer, an operations layer, and a decision support layer. It's all about routing cargo and moving that back and forth. But if you read this chapter, it sort of goes through how you can even separate on those concepts. So capability, for example, is I think another example somewhere in the book is a factory where capability is all the machines that you have and managing that and the capacity of those machines. And then operations is actually using them. And decision support could be who gets to use them or when do we use them. Right? But I don't know what the person who's asking the question means
Yeah.
by a modeling paradigm.
Well, maybe Daniel can elaborate. But one thing that is a method that is explained in the Blue Book is context mapping. Maybe
Yeah.
you can go a bit into context mapping as a way
Yeah.
to.
That's of course one that is better understood, I guess. Once you understand bounded context, and we didn't really finish
Well,
defining that.
maybe we should finish that first.
Yeah. So bounded context now is basically a model in isolation. It's saying here, this language, we cannot agree on a single language with everybody. Sales and shipping and inventory and staff management, etc. It serves no point. If we try that, we will fail. And the innovation in DDD is, well, let's not try that. Let's accept that the language is messy and evolve separately, but let's find some area where we can say, well, here we're going to draw a boundary, a context, right? Here we're going to say language has this meaning. This is the language we use. These are the words. These are the idioms, the expressions, the grammar that we're using. This is the model, the domain model. And inside that context, we're going to be very deliberate and precise and consistent. Something is going to mean one thing inside that context and not outside of it. And another context might have different words and language and definitions and model and everything. So something that means, let's go back to the product example at Amazon. In a shipping context, product means something that I can ship. It comes in a box, maybe even multiple boxes for a single product. These are the dimensions of the box. This is the weight. This is how many people we need to carry this box, for example, or I need a truck of this size, or I don't know, any. The needs they have for the concept of product are entirely different from sales, where it's about, how do we sell this thing? How can we make this product attractive? How can we make suggestions about product? So the definition of product itself might be entirely different. It's something we can sell. It's something we can ship. It's something we can stock. And then the benefit of deliberately, explicitly agreeing on those boundaries, on those bounded context, is that now you have something small where it's easier to understand as a whole, because somebody could be productive in the sales context without ever having to learn any of these other contexts. So that's one benefit, but it allows us to evolve that context separately. We don't need to, if we want to change how a product works, it doesn't affect any of the other contexts. They have a different definition of product. We don't care about it, right? So we get more freedom. We can start moving faster.
Yeah.
So it's bounded context in that sense, or a complexity management technique, and a way to basically speed up development. There's a cost to identifying them and enforcing them and evolving them, but there's a long-term benefit in having them. Right? And that's hard to grasp because I guess because we're not used to thinking of a language as a first-class concept or a model as a first-class concept.
Maybe that also solves the question Filippo had. Like, some are skeptical. Many devs gives up on discussing and agreeing on a language because it's too hard.
Well,
Maybe
if you're trying to build software for a complex domain, it's going to be hard. I'm sorry, right?
yeah. We actually need someone with the capabilities to facilitate this. I can imagine, right? Facilitate it, have the knowledge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, of course. Well, that's maybe part of the problem there is that the software industry is not only very young, but it's growing extremely fast. It's doubling every 5 years. That means that everybody who's now a professional programmer, half of them was not a professional programmer 5 years ago. right?
Yeah.
So you have a lot of people with no experience and not even enough people to coach them and to train them and to guide them,
Yeah.
right?
It doesn't scale that easy.
Yeah. So obviously you shouldn't put um, those people with little experience on a highly complex project. But you've all read the Boeing story, so where they
Yeah.
paid
So
people
back,
$9 in India for building,
so there we
these.
back to the distilling the core, right? Start a bit with distilling the core, then you know what's the hard part and who to put up. That's what
Yeah,
everyone's.
put your top talent on there.
Yeah.
Um, but bounded contexts are, so if domains are problem space, bounded contexts are solution space. That's where you decide as a designer, or well, all of you as your entire team, of course, and organization and stakeholders should agree on these bounded contexts and say, well, here in this context, we're going to talk exclusively about sales, and that's going to be our language, and this is going to be the model, and we're not trying to synchronize it. Even if, one example could be money in one context could mean the value of money, how much somebody should pay me or whatever. Money in a different context could mean something like the actual banknotes that a national bank would print. It's also money, but it's an entirely different definition. It might be a single value object in one context. It might be a huge elaborate model in a different context. Same for product, same for
Yeah.
all kind of concepts. Um, and then to answer the question about
Yeah.
context mapping again, I would say context mapping in a sense is a tactic for getting the strategic benefit of contexts, of bounded contexts. It's really, how can we start drawing and finding these contexts, and how can we start reasoning about the relations between these things. So that's the beauty of it. If you start thinking of a model as a standalone thing with a name, right, the bounded context gets a name. That name should be part of the ubiquitous language. If you start thinking of a context like that, you can start thinking of these high first class concepts in relation to each other, and you can start saying, well, this context has a dependency on that one, and you can start thinking about what does that dependency look like. You can say, well, this one is downstream. It means that if something changes in one, it might influence this one. Or it's conformist. It's saying, I'm going to stick to the language of that other model because maybe that's the best choice. Or maybe it just grew that way and now we're stuck with it, but at least let's label it and say, well, this one is conformist. And now that we have names for these patterns, for basically the relationships between different models and languages in our huge system, we can start discussing about these patterns uh, as first class things. We can say, well, we can come up with a strategy now. We can start saying things like, we have a context for sales, and it's dependent on a payments context. It's conformist to that context. It's using that language, but that restricts us in our ability to add different payment methods. Um, let's separate that. So let's apply the pattern called separate ways. Move
Yeah.
those. No, that's not separate ways. This would be the example I'm thinking of would be more like an anti-corruption layer. Let's, instead of this sales model depending or using language from the payments model, let's
Mm-hmm.
separate that out, make that sort of an anti-corruption layer that translates between the payments context and the sales context. And now we created the ability in the long term to add more types of payments, for example. Very, very superficial example, but this is this activity is what I would call strategic design. It's starting to reason about the long term, the bigger picture of my entire system, and how we're going to move in the future, where we're going to focus our attention. So that covers sort of 2/3 of the whole strategic design part. It's
Yeah.
domain distillation. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Where should we focus our attention? Bounded context. Let's separate things. Let's isolate them. Let's agree on their boundary, and let's be very strict about guarding that boundary around that language and model. Let's start thinking about the relation of these between these things. Let's decide on how to move and evolve them. And then the third part is the large scale structures chapter, where it's going even beyond that and looking at even bigger picture. Um, so
Cool.
that sort of outlines the whole
Yeah.
strategic design part. Um,
So we have. Thank you for that. We have 10 more minutes, and we promised the viewers to talk a bit more about books, because that's
all right.
what this is all about, and especially why aren't people reading into strategic design? I think that was a top question, and I think we might have answered that. And a few other questions that was related. What's the relationship between the Blue Book and Von Vernon's book, and what are these books? You talk about the must-read books before you read the Blue Book.
Yeah. So Von Vernon's book is called Implementing Domain-Driven Design, and he does an excellent job of making it a lot more practical. Right? It's if Eric's book is maybe a design book, Von's book is a programming book. There's more than that in that, but
Yeah,
it's for many of us it was sort of the book that showed us, here's how to actually start programming with domain-driven design, and here's how you can start thinking about things. This is the kind of discussions you need to be having with your team. This is how you evolve things.
it's a great war story, right? If you think about
Yeah, in a sense, yeah, it has very concrete examples and guides you sort of through it. So I think maybe not everything would be still the way I do it now, but that doesn't really matter. That's normal. As I said, this industry evolves very fast.
it, yeah,
There's things in there that I imagine that even Vaughn would now maybe do differently, because he's all, I think that book is about 8 years old or something now, 7, 8, I don't know. I'm sure he has, he's now more into other approaches, reactive, etc., that are not really in that book. But it's still a good book. I think it's been a while since I've read it. There's a bunch of other books. There's a new one by Alexei Zimarev on applying DDD in C sharp, I think. There's a book
core
by
specifically too.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's .NET Core specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
I
two,
need to
two.
start reading it.
I'm sorry.
It's on my shelf. I need to start reading it.
There's two great books by on basically applying DDD in functional programming. One is Debashish Ghosh on doing it in Scala, very sort of pure functional programming and that kind of terminology. And then sort of the polar opposite is Scott Flaskin's book on applying it in F sharp, where he's sort of avoiding using words like monad and applicative, but really explains it through his very sort of elegant, natural style, and they're both really good books in their own way. And I really like Scott's book because it gives sort of the first chapter or something is a very nice sort of overview of the essence of domain-driven design. And then the must-read books. Well, I have a hard time calling something a must-read book because there's always stuff in there that has influenced me very much at the point in time when I read it, because maybe that was the book I needed to read at that point in my learning experience. But well, let me just Google the Jill
Yeah.
Nicola book.
Jafar said to elaborate a bit, it's Patterns, Principles, and Practices of Domain-Driven Design by Scott and Nick. Is also
That's the one I was going to mention. The
yeah.
one by Jill Nicola that I was looking for is called Streamlined Object Modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of like for me, a lot of that book, and again, it's 10 years ago since I read it, I think, but at the time, it gave me this sort of insight on you can do this stuff. You're allowed to reason about this stuff. Object Thinking by Dave West. I think I read that one a lot later after I had some more experience already. Would I recommend that as a beginner's book? Maybe not, but it shows sort of a philosophy of software design. Rebecca Wersbrock, there's gold in there in her
Yeah.
books. Martin Fowler, some of the patterns in, for example, patterns of enterprise application architecture, some of those would probably not be very relevant anymore today. Same with his old book on refactoring, but he has a new one now that I haven't read yet. Maybe Michael Feathers, right? Working effectively with legacy code, because a lot of issues people have with domain-driven design is that they need to do it or want to do it in an existing legacy system that has no tests and no model and nothing. How
Okay.
do you start there? Well, he offers a very concrete approach that allows you to sort of find seams and then break it apart and start adding better tests and then gradually evolve there. Once you master techniques like that, um, domain-driven design is going to be easier. If you don't write unit tests today, start there, because DDD depends on evolving models continuously. Without tests and without refactoring skills, evolving models is very hard and very expensive and painful and full of failure, and as a consequence very slow, because you need to like triple check everything before you can make any kind of move. So start there. That's the basics, right? I tell juniors to TDD, write their tests first for everything until they have enough experience to decide when they don't need
Yeah.
TDD.
It's,
Um,
it's a bit going into the shuhari, right? You start Scrum with you need to do it in this order, and then at some point you find out, well, this at this point I have some other thing I need to. Well, is it still abiding to the principles? Yeah, well, do it, and
yeah,
eventually you'll grow into the re format, right, of the
yeah,
master. Then you might not even start with TDD, but it's always good to just do it at the start, like six, at least 6 months to
yeah.
start. I'm don't
I
want to
wouldn't want
jump.
to put a number on it, but
No,
yeah, and
but
or things like XP. There's a lot of valuable things in extreme programming that are very useful and helpful to start. If you have those, you're building a culture where DDD is going to thrive much better. Things like pair programming or mob programming, you can, if everybody's on their own machine coding on their own, I don't think you can do really good DDD, because you don't have the discussions, you don't have the agreement on models and language and boundaries. You
yeah,
have no ways to enforce boundaries. It's not going to work.
I always show the picture with everyone in the open spaces with their headphones on. Well, no
Yeah,
communication, so words
exactly.
just mean nothing anymore. Okay,
There's
well, I think the hour is through.
All right.
There's
Maybe I have one question for the audience that would be interesting to me. Um, would you be interested in sort of more of these kind of sessions where we dive into, maybe take one chapter or even one part of a chapter, like responsibility layers, and go into detail and do sort of a discussion of that? Is that something you'd be interested in, or more sort of broad or introductory topics? Or I'd love to know that.
Yeah, I will definitely put out a tweet later today asking this. Uh, Thank you. And I see already a few yes, yes, yes. So I think we should dive into more. And there was a lot of other questions I still have. So I think this will definitely be something we can do next time. So by this, thank you very much, Matthias, for your great insights.
Thanks for having me.
And hopefully till next time. To everyone else, if you have something you want to discuss, we're trying to get more engagement from audiences. We're trying to set up a Zoom function and see if we can really make this a virtual meetup. But until then, go to our website, virtualddd.com. In the bottom, there's email, and you can always email us with ideas or anything else.
And my colleague just tells me that I have to do one last thing,
Yeah,
which is mention that Eric is going to teach a 4-day DDD immersion class, which is a lot about this sort of strategic design stuff, in Amsterdam in February,
awesome.
February 10 to 13. And you can find it at training.ddeurope.com.
That's great. Last time you did that, I was already somewhere else. So now I hope I can do it.
He doesn't do a lot of these classes anymore, so we're always very happy if we can convince him to do another one.
And I hope to get him into the virtual DDD ones. I already emailed him, so hopefully that comes in. But anyone else is free to join. Go to dddeurope.com too and show it. And there's a lot more of these conferences going on. So thank you, Matthias. And to
Thank
the
you.
rest, see you next time. Bye bye.